Good evening from Rocky Mountain PBS. I'm Cynthia Hessen. This is Colorado State of Mind. We have two topics on our minds tonight: health care costs and next week's historic recall election against state legislators in Colorado. On health care, we will introduce you shortly to business journalist Stephen Brill, whose 7-month investigation of hundreds of real-life medical bills gave him insight into a marketplace that doesn't operate at all like a free market, he says, where sellers have all the information, consumers are confused, and the amount charged or paid for two identical procedures at the same hospital can vary by thousands of dollars. Also, the profit margins of medical device companies and non-profit hospitals are nothing less than astounding. So we will come to that shortly. But first, the more pressing matter is the occasion of the first ever recall elections against two state legislators. The voting has begun this week, last couple of days, I believe, in Pueblo, and just yesterday, perhaps, in Colorado Springs. Next Tuesday night, of course, is when we will know how that recall count came in. So here in the studio to talk about it are three professional observers of the fraught circumstances, the court decisions, the campaigns for and against State Senators John Morse and Angela Giron. Our guests are Colorado College Professor Emeritus Bob Levy, reporter Megan Schrader from the Gazette of Colorado Springs, and Alicia Caldwell, editorial writer for the Denver Post. Now, we know all this, of course, is tied to the gun control laws that are now in effect. They were passed by the state legislature. We would then expect that the National Rifle Association would get its oar in the water with some money to work against these two legislators, these two Democrats. Less expected, perhaps, was that $350,000 from Mayor Bloomberg just in the last couple of weeks. This is a real battle of money, isn't it, Professor?
It is a battle of money. I have the pleasure of living in Senate District 11, and I've also had the pleasure of being in New Hampshire for the New Hampshire primary and Iowa for the Iowa caucuses and presidential years, and that's what this election reminds me of. Tons of money, tons of effort, skilled professionals going after votes, all concentrated on a very small electorate. So the result is, for the small number of people living in these two Senate districts, I've received 13 pieces of mail so far in the election. Anytime I turn on my television set, I'm likely to see a television commercial for John Morse. So it really is the most intense political environment I've ever seen, both with the money and with the political activity.
That is something to say from someone who's been in Colorado since 1968. Alicia, the money strikes me, as I understand it, if this were a regular Senate race, the limit of money you could spend would be $400,000. So this is, apparently they're not worried about how to get rid of people.
And we don't even know the half of it yet. The C4s, it'll take years to figure out how much they've spent on this, on these particular recalls. You clearly get the sense they're flooding the zone with money, with people, with flyers. But when you think about, okay, what are really the stakes here from a voting perspective? It's not going to change the balance of power in the Colorado Senate. This is really about principle, and this is more of an effort to use a recall as a cudgel. And it has been growing in use that way over the last several years. The Washington Post did a piece last week that said of the 32 successful recall petitions in this nation since 1911, fully a third of those have taken place since 2011. So, you really see it sort of growing in magnitude.
I would say, yes, jumping in magnitude.
Yeah, we're heading into perpetual election territory.
And Megan, this is one thing that people against this recall have said. It has, to them, has not been about the gun control or the particular legislators. It's about what rises to the level of recall.
Right. When do you oust a sitting lawmaker? What warrants the use of that recall for the people who want John Morse and Angela Giron out of office? Their policies on the gun control issues, for them, that's enough. And I think John Morse and Angela Giron are saying it's not enough. We were elected. That's the will of the voters, and it should stand.
You know, it does raise the question, though, of what ought to be the standard for recall. Should it be an ethical transgression, malfeasance, a crime, or should it be that you simply disagree with people on policy? I guess I'm of the opinion it should be the former. It should be reserved for bad behavior. And it's distressing to me, frankly, to see it moving into territory of, hey, we disagree with these folks policy-wise, so we're just going to, get money from around the country on a hot-button issue such as gun control and beat them into submission so that the legislature is no longer willing to take on any controversial issues.
Well, it is expensive to hold these elections as well, but it is, the people who rallied and collected these signatures, it's their right to do that, and they say that it's a very organic, grassroots sort of thing. That's yet to be seen. A lot of money's hidden in the C4s, like you said, so we'll find out. But
remind us, a C4 is a nonprofit organization.
It is a nonprofit. They call themselves social welfare nonprofits, and they're allowed under law, federal law, to participate in political issues like ordinary nonprofits wouldn't be allowed to. And they don't have to disclose who their donors are or how they spend their money. In the next 3 years, we'll start to see their federal tax returns come in. If they file them, some of them might just disband before they ever even file a tax return. So we may never know what's being spent and who's spending it in this election.
There are some changes that are affecting this election. Number one, a court decision a number of years ago enabled people to pay signature gatherers. That's changed everything in Colorado. It's made it much easier to use the initiative. And now we see it's making it easier to use the recall. There's another factor here, and that is half our state senators are elected in presidential years when there's a big turnout. It would be very difficult to recall them. But the other half are elected in gubernatorial years, as John Morse was. That greatly reduces the number of voters and thus the number of signatures required to mount a recall. But one of the most interesting developments is the fact that in El Paso County, at least, Colorado Springs, they use their smartphones to have the registration with them. And thus, anyone who signed, before they took their signature, they knew they were a registered voter in Colorado Springs, in Senate District 11. So, politics is always changing. And I really agree with Alicia that we're going to see many more recalls. Number one, you can pay people now to gather signatures. Digital technology enables you to check the qualifications of the signer on the spot. I think just as we're using the initiative more now, we're going to start using the recall more now.
I think some of these broader, I think some of the things that Dr. Levy is mentioning have some broader impacts that we really ought to be concerned about. If you can gather 12,000 signatures rather easily, roughly speaking, 12,000, you can put anyone through this hell of a recall, any of our elected lawmakers. They're going to be a lot less willing to take on issues that are controversial, that may anger some interest group from afar, from another side of the country. And I think it's concerning, this marriage of money and technology, the effect that it may have on politics and policy in Colorado.
Megan, the matter of gathering the signatures and some other things sent this matter in and out of court. Can you run through those the highlights of how we got where we are?
There was a lot of them. So the first challenge came just on the signatures themselves. The petitions they circulated, was the language on that constitutional? That's the first thing that went to court, and the judge said yes, it met the merits of the Constitution. This is a valid petition. It needs to go on the ballot. Governor John Hickenlooper set a date for elections, and then the next challenge came, and this one was from the Libertarian Party, and they were questioning whether this was whether the election date was correct, whether they should have a larger time period to get their names on the ballot as a potential replacement for John Morse. And the ruling in that case really threw a wrench in the election because it was going to be every registered voter in the district was going to get a mail ballot, which is huge if you think about it. The ballot comes to you, you don't even have to, show up at a voting precinct. But the court ruling in that decision made mail ballots impossible because of
the time was so short.
Exactly. So now it's going to be active voters who are willing to go to the precincts to cast their ballot. They're going to be the ones who make this decision, and that, I think, is going to have a huge impact in the outcome.
Yeah, the turnout is really, I think, will be one of the driving factors in who wins. The Democrats are going to have to work very hard because they're going to be less, those who are trying to unseat these legislators are going to be very motivated. Those who may have sort of an opinion about it are not going to be as motivated.
Yeah. Dr. Levy, I understand the way things look is that Angela Giron in Pueblo is probably pretty safe in her seat, but that John Morse has a bigger battle.
Well, I think it's very difficult to predict either of these elections, partially because of what Alicia just said. But I think the real situation here is that John Morse has to turn out an electorate that is not famous for turning out in non-presidential years. I think the one asset he may have, in addition to all the money that he's received, incidentally from outside of the state, that's another thing that's happened to Colorado politics. Most of the money now comes from outside the state. I call this the nationalization of Colorado election campaigns. But Morse really has to get this electorate to the polls. I think one asset he might have, if Barack Obama did anything right in Colorado in 2012, it was getting every last voter in Denver, Boulder, and even the downtown kind of voters in Colorado Springs who will vote Democratic. Let's not leave out what may be a really good ground game, as they call it, getting voters to the polls. Having just really perfected this in 2012 in Colorado and given the key role of the Democratic Party in defending Morse, I think if Morse wins, it may be because of a good ground game as well as all the ads.
What he's fighting for is his seat, but he wasn't going to have that seat much longer anyway.
Right. He's term limited, and this is again. It goes to what's this really going to accomplish? I think what it's intended to accomplish is to scare legislators around the country, state legislators who may be considering taking up gun control issues. Look what's going to happen to you if you decide to go this route. The anti-gun control interests have managed to quash any sort of effort at the federal level, and this is a continuation of that theme.
Last question to you, Megan, about the procedure. Now, so voting has begun. There are vote centers in each of these counties. But other than that, they are not coordinating with each other on how it's being done. Did the two groups of signature gatherers have anything to do with each other?
They did. They were under an umbrella organization, the Basic Freedom Defense Fund. And there were two other attempts to oust lawmakers to put it on ballots, and they didn't collect enough signatures in those districts. So there was kind of a coordinated effort there. Two of them were not successful. Two of them were. They're going to be on ballots in Pueblo and Colorado Springs, and Election Day is Tuesday.
And I noticed that the elections officials have been assuring everyone they've tested the machines and so forth. Dr. Levy, a last thought on this as we get ready to watch Tuesday for what happens?
The thing that's interested me most about the campaigns is the way both sides have not run on the gun issue. Interestingly, Morse began his campaign, and I think quite wisely, running against the idea of the recall and introduced this theme, well, it ought to be for malfeasance in office. Well, there's nothing in the Constitution about that. All you need is the signatures and you have a recall. More lately, Morse has been running against what we would call the extreme politics of the Republican Party, making accusations about being in favor of abortion and taking away women's rights to choose. On the other hand, the other side in Colorado Springs, that's Bernie Herpin, they really haven't been running on guns either. They've been running on the issue, he doesn't represent you, he's not listening to the voters. This is a trend that's occurring where they don't really run on the issues anymore. They conduct polls and then steer the campaign toward what the polls say will win. So if you came down from the moon and looked at the ads and the flyers, you would hardly realize that this was about guns.
Or the truth, for that matter. Both sides in this campaign have run horribly untrue ads. They either have just huge omissions of fact or are just completely based on a lie. It's been really disappointing and kind of depressing. The ads.
Apparently just all too regular for elections nowadays. Thank you all for your insights tonight. Dr. Bob Levy, Megan Schrader, and Alicia Caldwell. We will all have an eye on Southern Colorado Tuesday for the outcome of these two recall elections. Stephen Brill is the business entrepreneur who started and ran Court TV, the American Lawyer magazine, and Brill's Content. He's currently CEO and co-founder of Journalism Online. Last year, he spread the word among friends and colleagues that he would like to evaluate medical bills that had been encountered by anyone using the healthcare system. And he had an overwhelming response from people with stories and wildly outsized bills for their medical care. This week, the IMA Foundation, along with the Colorado Trust and the Colorado Health Foundation, brought Stephen Brill to Denver for a leadership forum on his findings, which he writes about in the Time magazine article called "The Bitter Pill: Why Medical Bills Are Killing Us." I also had a chance to ask him some questions, and we started actually with the conclusion he has reached after all this writing and research.
The central problem with healthcare in the United States is that there are too many people making too much money, and they're not doctors and they're not nurses. They're hospital administrators, they're marketing people at hospitals, they're drug company executives, they're CAT scan salesmen, they're everybody except the doctors and nurses, and we've created this economy that's like this whole separate island off of the United States called the healthcare economy, where everybody's rich, everybody makes more money every year, where you and I and everybody else since 2008, it's been kind of rough in the economy. It's been clear sailing for them, and they just sort of leech off of the whole rest of the economy. The cost they exact from the rest of us, it kills our economy. It makes our manufacturing costs higher. It takes more for an employer to hire someone because of healthcare costs. It takes money out of our treasury through Medicare and Medicaid. And we've created this alternate universe based on this romantic notion we once had that the free market can apply to healthcare when it is no free market. People who buy healthcare don't have any information and they have no choice. They just get fleeced. Well, in most cases, they don't. It also, until recently, didn't cost them anything because they had very low co-pays, they had rich insurance policies. Now they have higher co-insurance pays and higher deductibles, so they're starting to care. Now, conservatives say, well, that's the root of the problem. If people didn't have health insurance, you would never have had this because they would have had, quote, skin in the game, and they would never have tolerated it. But that's patently ridiculous. I can have all the skin in the game that you want, but if someone's charging me $13,700 for a cancer drug for one dose, and I'm going to die if I don't take it, what good does all my skin in the game do? I've got to get it. And one of those patients in the article was charged $13,700, and guess what? He had 100% skin in the game because he didn't have insurance. And you know, George Will and all the conservatives in the world can say, well, if he had skin in the game, the price wouldn't be as high. It's not true. Of course, the hospital, the quote non-profit hospital, paid about $3,000 for the drug, cost the drug maker about $300. That drug maker has a higher profit margin than most of the software companies we think of, like Google or Microsoft. And software is considered the highest gross profit margin product in the world, but the drug companies just kill them. Software companies also have a lot of research and development, but if you do what I did, which is actually look at their books, look at their financial filings, look at their debt filings, look at the presentations they give to their investors where they brag about their profit margins. Their R&D costs are like 10%, maybe 20%, and their margins are 80, 90%. That is just a myth, and if more journalists bothered to do the numbers and actually read the documents, they wouldn't be allowed to get away with that myth. In almost every community in town we know of, the nonprofit hospital, the leading, is usually could be the most profitable business in town, has the highest paid executive of any executive in town, but they're thought of as nonprofit, and they always have an annual gala, and it's considered a great, civic event, which it is. Let's remember, these people are curing the sick. You can't take that away from them. They are doing good work. That's important to remember. But the charitable contributions could amount to 0.5% or 1% or 1.5% of their revenue. And it's really sort of a showcase to sort of make them beloved in the community, which they should be. But when you're beloved in the community, maybe you shouldn't have armies of lawyers who are suing people in that community into bankruptcy because they can't afford your charges. That's not our typical notion of a charitable nonprofit institution, which is suing people into bankruptcy. Their profit margins are typically higher than any other business in town. Profit, nonprofit, profit. We spend more money in this country on knees and hips than Hollywood takes in the box office. One of the reasons is they're advertised so much. And
so you start thinking you need what you're doing.
And doctors recommend it because it's a very profitable procedure. Hospitals love it because they make high profits on the medical devices. The medical device makers are, again, among the most high profit margin companies in the world. And we're in this cycle where we spend more for stuff we may not need, whether it's an artificial hip or a CAT scan that is, as often as not is totally unnecessary, but these are high profit tests. The CAT scan makers are high profit companies, and there's no marketplace. If you go into an emergency room and someone says, well, just to be sure I should do a CAT scan, what are you going to say? No, don't just be sure. I'll take my chances. You're going to say, okay, do the CAT scan. Then the hospital typically pays for the CAT scan equipment, I think, in the first year. The equipment lasts for 6 to 7 years, so it's 100% profit after that. And they charge enormous amounts of money, and just to be sure. And you're a consumer, you don't know if you need that. And by the way, you don't know what the price is. And by the way, if they told you what the price is, you don't know how that compares to the price, down the corner or down the block or some other place. That's not a marketplace. That's one solution. I think it's an unrealistic solution. I spell out in the article, I won't bore you here, but the taxpayers would actually save money if a 64-year-old were allowed to buy a Medicare policy as opposed to get the premium support that same person is now going to get under Obamacare. But leaving that aside, I don't think that's realistic. I think you can attack this problem in some other ways, challenge the tax-exempt status of nonprofit hospitals until they actually lower their prices and start breaking even instead of making huge profits, or break even plus allow some for overhead. They say they have these enormous capital costs. That's because they keep building. We have more hospital beds in this country than we need, and hospitals keep expanding. Why do they keep expanding? Because they can, because they make all this extra money, and because once they expand, the people running it can get higher salaries, because if you're running a bigger organization with more buildings, you're obviously in a different peer group, so the compensation consultants will say, well, you deserve this much now, not just this much. It's natural human nature. These are not bad people.
That much is the market work, right?
Right.
Without the other.
But we've just created this sort of unstoppable snowball of cost because we live in the romantic notion that, well, it's a free market and there's competition when there really isn't any competition. If we didn't have a free, open market, healthcare would be worse. The bottom line is we spend 2 or 3 times as much per capita on healthcare in the United States as any other developed country, and our results, the health of our people, the outcomes, are not nearly as good. That sort of says it all.
And that was Stephen Brill talking at length about his Time magazine article earlier this year, The Bitter Pill, Why Medical Bills Are Killing Us. In coming weeks, the IMA Foundation and Rocky Mountain PBS will post more of Brill's leadership address online. And that is Colorado State of Mind this week. You may see the program again at video.rmpbs.org. Next week, we plan to preview some big ideas for improving the lives of Blacks and Latinos in Colorado and tell you more about the ambitious plan of the Colorado Black Roundtable. Please join us for that next week. Thanks for tuning in this weekend. I'm Cynthia Hessen. Good night.